Right, I'll start in a few seconds then. So if you just start off looking at me. Thanks.
Yeah.
Said you were born into a fishing family in Flukeborough. Can you tell me a bit about your early life?
Yeah, well, in those days, Flukeborough was a fishing village. It's totally different now. There's less than a handful of fishermen, but when I left school, Dad bought me a horse and cart and I fished alongside Father and about 25 other fishermen. A wonderful way of life. A slow way of life, but a wonderful way. And then, right from that very early age, I had an interest in horses, and we used big horses, not like farm horses, but big tall horses, because we waded deep water. We waded in the channels, pulling a cart and pulling a net behind for gathering the shrimps. Winter months we used to go out on the cockle beds gathering the cockles, and then setting the nets in the spring. So I had a lot to learn as a youngster, and if you've got your father alongside, you can always ask questions. I was lucky to have him for a very long time.
Yes, following the sands was the phrase used by the old fisher folk. Do you have any tales about your predecessors?
No, but Dad used to tell me that his mother was a very good cockler. Now, Dad, this last few years when there was tons of cocklers in Morecambe Bay, a lot of people came on the job, cost us a lot of money to be made. They weren't fishermen. But I was brought up to fish the bay when you could just like rake a living. It was really hard work, and you didn't drag the cockles when they weren't so plentiful. You used a hand tool called a cram, and I used to pick them one at a time, and I could pick a basket full, right up to the brim. And Dad said, "There's not many people could do that." He said, "But my mother could do that." He said, "You must take after her."
Yes, and you've been married to Olive for many years now. Tell me how you met Olive.
Well,
I'll ask that question again. So, said you've been married to Olive for many years. Tell me how you met.
Well, I was always interested in Flukeborough Band. Dad encouraged me to join, and I knew Olive lost her husband, the first husband, Bill, to the age of about 42 years, and he was in the Flukeborough Band. His eldest son and the next one down, Bill and Robert, were in the band, so I knew them quite well. And after he died, quite a while after he died, we had two market gardens, very busy market gardens, and young Bill, I got talking to him, and he used to go and help out on the farm. And I said, "Well, I have a lot of work on, did you want you to come and help me?" And he used to come along and help me in the garden, weeding the carrots and setting the potatoes, and he was a really good help. Well, I took him home one evening, and he'd mentioned to his mother about me, and he said, "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" And that was the first time I'd spoken to Olive, and then it just went on from there. And this was about 2 years after Bill's father had died. I think it was about 3 years after when we decided to get married. Dad and it was at home really. It was all work and no play. It was sand, work and more work. And Dad was the type. He said work never killed anyone. We had very little leisure time. Weekends I would go with my pals to the dances, but during the day, if there's anything to be done, if we weren't on the sand, we'd be in the market garden working, in the greenhouses and setting lettuce and growing tomatoes and vegetables. We're always very busy.
Yes, and you became the Sands Guide in 1963. Can you tell me a bit about the early days at Guide's farm?
Well, I was out on the sands cockling, and this figure, you could see him. It was Gren Harrison. He was a really nice bloke and very fair bloke. He was like policeman of the sands, they called him. He was what they call a beck watcher. He worked for the North West Water Board. Now, it was his job really to come out on the sands to make sure the fishermen stuck to the bylaws. So on this particular day, he come out with cockling. He used to take a little brass gauge out of his pocket and just take a handful of cockles out of the bag what you'd filled, and he'd test them. If they dropped through, they're too small, and he'd just sort of say, "Well, these are too small. You'll have to leave them for a while," But at the same time on that day, he said to me on the way home, he was walking aside of us in the cart, and he said that the guide at Grange over Sands was giving up his job, and he thought, would I be interested? He said, I think you're just a likely person for the job. And he said, if you're interested, Cedric, he said, I'll drop your details off one day. So he came round, did Gren, and dropped me the details, and it'd been advertised seemingly, which I hadn't seen it, but I applied, and following that I was invited for an interview, and the interview was Lord Cavendish and 3 other trustees. Seemingly there was only one other bloke, fisherman, applied, and I was chosen. Now, I'd never been down to Guides Farm before, and in those days it wasn't the Lord Cavendish's, now it was his father. Now they did tell us that the old house was in quite a state, and if we were to move in, we'd have to, do the alterations ourselves, whatever we wanted, to make it habitable. But we just loved it when we saw it, and I always had the love of the sands. There was land went with it, and we could keep a few animals, and that's how we started off. It was hard work, but we loved it, and we've been here now 47 years and loved every minute of it.
And you've got about 12 acres here. Can you tell me something about your farming activities here?
Well, when you've animals, at a tie, but with a love of animals, it means that, as a fisherman, you're governed by the tides, and you get up such unearthly hours, so, you're not used to lying in bed in the morning. Well, it's the same when you've animals now. Each morning I have to be up with the first job. I take Olive a drink, have my breakfast, and then I go out and see to my animals. It's first we have some stock, stores as they call them, like bullocks. I raise them from calves. I buy them at the auction mart, either Bentham, Lancaster or Kendal, at 3 or 4 weeks old. And the reason why I buy them at that age is if you can buy them older, but if you buy them older, they're usually more wilder. They haven't been handled. If I buy them as young stock, I handle them and then they quiet them. Well, it's like, they do well because they're just like pets. But you see, with 3 horses as well, 2 Shetland ponies and a bigger horse, and 6 beasts, and I have 30 hens, I think it is, something like 30 hens. So all these have to be fed morning and evening, and then between that, the phones during the season, the phones non-stop, and then the walking season starts in late April, starting May. So we lead very busy lives.
And you still go out to catch flukes at the fluke nets, I believe.
I love it. Yeah, I set every spring. Well, my licence came the other day. You need a licence. I mean, in my younger days, you didn't need a licence, but now you don't pay for a licence, but you have to have a licence, so that with the sea fishery officer goes round, your nets are buoyed, and on the buoy you have to put your initials like CR and GOS, meaning Cedric Robinson, Grange over Sands, so that they can identify those nets. They know whose they are, just in case you're sticking by the bylaws or you're breaking the laws. And the other thing is, we love fish. I enjoy setting the nets and going out there, but also I enjoy filleting, and I love eating them as well. They are lovely. The flukes caught in Morecambe Bay are so sweet, almost like plaice. We almost live on them during the season.
Yes, I know you used to go cockling, but have you been cockling recently?
I've never been cockling, but a friend of mine, he has a second home, like a farm up in Scotland on the Isle of Arran, and he had this young farmer. He's a tenant, and he came to Grange for a holiday, and my friend Larry rung me up and he said, any chance of taking him out to see these cocklers? So I said yes. I was interested in going out to see them as well, because there's about 300 of them out in the bay. It was a long journey from here. We set off, there was about 6 of us, me, Larry, Mike, his friend, his wife and a young child. But Larry suggested that I wear my yellow jacket, like as if it would be like authority, like a policeman. And he said, and I'll wear mine. Well, there was 4 of us in yellow jackets. And off we set. We went from Kensbank, and we had to go miles round because the River Leven had moved its course. Although it had left a lyre in it was a very deep one. We had to go a long way down the estuary before we could cross it. And then once we got through with about half a mile to go onto a high sandbank to the Cocklers. Well, when they saw us coming in these yellow jackets, we expected to be able to talk to them, and they just left their equipment and run away. I think they must have thought, we were authority, and a lot of them must have been doing the cockling illegally. But it was a laugh really. We went out there to see them, and we didn't get much to see them at all because they ran away. But it was an experience to see 300 people out on the sands gathering cockles. But I think they've got the best of them now because the cockle beds haven't been opened this winter, this season, and they've been the sea fishery officer goes out there and they look at the beds and they reckon that they haven't grown like they should have done. They haven't. Well, I expected this because you cannot take, they were taking everything. They weren't fishermen. They weren't using sieves, riddles like we did. They used to drag everything in, the bivalves, the young cockles, and even sand. They got paid by weight, and that's what they used to do. They were taking the feed for the birds and robbing themselves, the local fishermen, of their livelihoods. And now they're suffering.
Yes, a large part of your life is the famous Cross Bay walks. Can you tell me how they started off?
Well, it was in a small way because when I come here, I'd never seen the previous guide before, but I shook his hand, and he wasn't, he didn't go out there regularly. He would rather do his fishing than doing the guiding, I think. But his son used to take the walks, but there was only about 1 walk a year, and that was advertised on the radio. He didn't have a telephone in Guide's Farm like we have, so you can imagine, people had to either listen to the radio. If they hadn't a radio, they didn't know about the walks. Well, a new guide coming along, and journalists and TV reporters, it soon opened up like new horizons for people in like a wide area. But on my first walk, there was no more than about 20 walkers. Olive went with me, and we started out from Grange over Sands railway station and walked over to Hess Bank, and that was the walk which I led for about 25 years until the river made a dramatic move and made it impossible to use that route.
Yes, also, can you tell me of your memories of the Royal Carriage Crossing in May 1985?
Oh, that was... a lot went into that because, Lord Cavendish and his estate manager, Mr. Lee I think it was, came down to see me, and they said they would see if it was possible to take this carriage crossing over the bay, and it was like be a nice opening for the driving trials at Holker Hall. Anyhow, I mean, it's no good going out and testing the river out there too much in advance because the river moves every day. But I've never known, I mean, it changes every day and it changes dramatically, but I've never known it move as quickly as it did in that last week. I would put my markers in and it would move 200 yards per tide. And when a river's moving, it's not stable. So it was the crossing was going to be doubtful, but at the very last day, I went out 3:30 in the morning, I think it was, took some friends with me, and went out, and it had settled down. The river had settled down, and it was firm as a rock. I was so pleased. Came back here, and Lord Cavendish rang me up. He said, Cedric, he said, is it on or is it off? So it was one man's decision. I said, it's on. All systems go. And then, you see, it had been confirmed from Buckingham Palace that Prince Philip would take part, but it had to be kept under wraps until we knew that the sands were safe. So a lot went into it. It was one man's decision. There were 2 police forces involved. We're in Lancashire, Cumbria at this side, Lancashire's over the other side of the bay, and they were worried. You know, they had a responsibility to look after him. But I had a phone call from a policeman. He said, "Mr. Robinson," he said, he wanted to know the line we would be coming on, and they were going to, you know, wanted me to draw a map for them. But he said, "You're lucky," he said, "you only have to look after him while he's on the sands." He said, "We have to look after him all the time he's in the area." But it was most enjoyable, and we told lots of friends, and it was probably the most memorable occasion of my lifetime, as apart from marrying Olive.
Yeah. And you've had several famous people with you on the sands. Can you tell me some stories? I remember you telling me about AJP Taylor in particular.
Well, AJP Taylor, that's going back to the very early, when we first came here, and it was arranged that, you know, you can take a walk out in the bay. We were near Humphrey Head, and suddenly we came across this Professor AJP Taylor, and you know, so we stopped and we had a chat, and then he joined the walk. But we went over an area. When you get a group of people and watery areas, it can soften up. It wasn't really dangerous quicksand, but the sand softened up, and he was frightened, and he stopped. And you know, it's a fear really. They have a fear of if they of going down, but it's worse if you stop. Now I ran back to him and told him to jump on my back very quickly, which he did, and I gave him a piggyback, so I'll always remember that. But it wasn't really dangerous. He just was pretty well frightened.
And can you tell me something about the unfortunate tragedies that have occurred on the bay, including, of course, the Chinese cockle picker tragedy?
Yes, well, in the very similar area, over 100 years ago, I think it was 12 or 14 young farmers lost their lives. They were crossing the sands. It was half term. That was like a holiday from farming, and they were all aged between 18 and 20 years of age, and they called the guides carters in those days, and they hired a carter to take them across the sands in this cart from Alithwaite, and I believe they stopped in the Guide Over Sands pub at Alithwaite. It was called a different name in those days, but people said when they came out they were merry, but they weren't drunk. They came to Kent's Bank, out into the bay, and the fishermen at Silverdale heard voices. Well, you know, the wind carries voices. It must have been blowing out to the west. The fishermen heard them and said they seemed merry and enjoying themselves. Well, when they got over towards Hest Bank, the river was probably hold of pre-skier in those days, and Dad always taught me as a lad with a horse and cart never to cross near a skier. You either go well up above or well down below, because the incoming tide scours so deep and it could be almost bottomless. Well, these poor souls crossed too near the scour. The horse dropped out of its depth. All occupants were tipped in the water and drowned, including the horse, and that's over 100 years ago. Well, almost at the same place, is it 3 years ago now, was the cockling tragedy. Now, these Chinese cocklers, they're only small people. I don't think they could speak very good English, and they were amongst other gangs of, you know, from all parts of this country, from Liverpool, from the northeast, and I think they felt a little bit inferior, and that's why they went out that night, to be on their own. But I cannot understand why they went out, because when they went out the tide was coming in, and I thought the other fishermen would have you know, tried to tell them something to, you know, to turn around and come back. Now they were on a high sandbank, and the tide always comes in first up the river. That's the lowest part of the bay. So that night they wouldn't know anything until the tide was all around them. They'd just be like cockling on an island, and there was just nowhere for them to go. I believe there was one of them saved on pre-skier. He had a phone call from one of his friends saying that we're in water. So he ran out from the land and he tried to swim from pre-skier across the first stretch of water, and the tide was coming in, and the tidal bore washed him back onto the skier. And lucky for him, a helicopter above with a powerful searchlight spotted him, and they called the Morecambe lifeboat, and that picked him up, and he was the only survivor.
Yes, talking about happier times, I remember one story you told me about several years ago when you were shrimping at night when these green luminous patterns
Oh,
appeared in the water. I've never seen that myself.
yes, like phosphorus. Yeah. Well, I would all, well, Dad sometimes when he was younger, his mother used to say he would change his horse more often than he changed his socks. And we had a few horses in our time and some good ones, but we bought this big horse from Morecambe, it'd been cabin on Morecambe front. We called it Banner, big bay, strong bay horse, and oh, it was grand in the water in the daytime. We hadn't had it long, and I took it this particular night, and oh, it's without you see it, it's almost.
We can carry on. It's okay. I mean, we can stop. We can stop for a second. Right. Cedric, one story I remember you telling me about was the green luminous water when you used to catch shrimps at night.
Ah yes, well, we call it foxfire. It's a wonderful experience really, but if you're a horse and you're frightened of it, it's a frightening experience. And this particular night, the horses I had, it just wanted to make one way into the deep water, and it absolutely petrified me. I'd had it it was a new horse, but I'd had it shrimping in the daytime, and it just went as if it'd been doing the job all its life. But it's totally different. Every movement causes these sparklets of coloured water. You know, every time the horse lifted its hoof and popped it down in the water, the splash everywhere. If you look at the wheels, the spokes on the wheels, you look behind the cart and you can see the shape of the net under the water, and it's all like illuminous. I say it is wonderful to see, and you don't see it much in your lifetime. But that night, my horse was absolutely petrified.
Yes, and I believe you also used to fish for starfish.
That was something new. A friend of mine came and said he'd been asked by someone in Grange if we could go and fish for starfish. He said there's a lot of the starfish coming into the bay down at Heysham. And so I got in touch with him, and he said, oh, you'll be all right, you'll be able to take your tractor down there right onto the scar. Well, I knew differently because Dad always warned me. When near the scars there are areas of clay where a tractor would just go down like a stone. Well, my friend Larry, he had a 4x4, and we took the equipment and we went over, and we found that we could get within about 100 yards of the scar, and then we took a wheelbarrow, tins, and it was a sight for sore eyes. The scar was absolutely littered with these huge starfish as big as your hand. Now, the thing was, you were gathering them, you were in water about knee deep, and after a while your hands got sore because it was like picking up sandpaper. So eventually we had to use gloves. And the other thing, totally different to fishing up in the bay, the tide comes in very quickly up in the bay and you can see it coming. And I know the times the tide, but down there it comes so slowly and you don't realise it's coming until your equipment starts floating away. But it was an experience, and there was a lot of starfish brought. We used to bring them back. They were washed in fresh water, which it would help to set them. Then they were put in formalin in buckets and all taken over to America. Now what they did with them over there, I wouldn't know.
And can you tell me about your experience of receiving the MBE from the Queen?
Oh, that was lovely. That was a wonderful surprise. Olive knew 6 months before, and she kept it from me because, because they said that although the Prime Minister had approved it, it still had to go before the Queen, and so she thought, well, if the Queen doesn't say yes, so she kept it from me right to the very last minute. We had some very good friends live down south, and they offered to pick us up, take us down to their house, stay overnight, and then drive to London the next morning, which we did. What an experience, Buckingham Palace. We parted going up the staircase, we parted, I went my way, they went theirs, and I was among a lot of nice people, but everyone seemed so posh. No one seemed to speak. and I followed the crowd, and then we were addressed by probably a major or someone like that, and given the gen of the day. But it was lovely meeting the Queen, because you know, the first thing she said was, "I believe you took my husband across the bay, Mr. Robinson," and then that just opened me up. I was very nervous till that point, but as soon as she said that, I spoke to her, you know, answered her questions, and she seemed to speak to me quite at length, whereas the other people, when you know, it was just a short. You told beforehand that she only keeps you, you know, when she puts out her hand, that's the time to go. Well, she was long enough before she shook my hand. I thought, well, this was nice. And then the other thing was, as I backed away and gave a bow, I had a hired suit, a very, very smart suit, and Oliver bought me a new pair of braces from Marks and Spencer's, but they weren't very good ones, because as soon as I leaned forward, this front brace on the right went flip and the other one went flop, and I came away with my trousers just slightly going down, so I had to put both hands in my pockets to lift them up a bit, so I felt a little bit embarrassed. But it was a wonderful experience, it was.
Said you are now I'll start again. Said you are now 76 years old. Do you have any plans to retire?
No, because I don't feel 76 at all. When, you know, I don't know whether I've got my father's genes, but Dad lived till 102 and he was fit right up till the end. But I think I've a few years left in me yet for the guided walks. I mean, the doctor has to send for me. I'm not one for going to the doctors, but she sends for me once a year, she said, you know, and I have my blood pressure taken, and everything's fine. So, I mean, I've had my MOT over the years. I mean, everyone has a little bit of something in their lifetime. I had a slip disc, I had a heart bypass operation, I've had a retina operation, and I've had 2 cataract operations. But they've all those things happened in the winter months, and then by spring I managed to get fit and well and carry on with the walks. So I can look back and say, well, I've been very, very lucky.
Cedric Robinson, thanks very much for speaking to me.
Thank you very much, Peter.